There's a piece here in Real Clear Politics. It's a fascinating piece by Sean, I believe it's pronounced Trend, but I'm not sure. And he's one of the authors of the Almanac of American Politics, I think, with Mike Barone. And I was on Capitol Hill a week or two ago. I don't remember. These weeks all run together, meeting a couple of very fine senators. And one of them said to me, look, we got to look at this demographics thing. This is a conservative. No, it's not Ted Cruz. I'm just saying. And so we need to figure out a way to reach out to this group and that. And I said, oh, no, not you too. Why don't you just reach out to the American people? Anyway, so in Real Clear Politics, this gentleman, Sean Trend, he says, what was really the most salient demographic change in 2012 from 2008, the presidential election? Was it the increase in Hispanic voters that we've been hearing about? Was it the turnout of African-American voters that we've been hearing? No. The most salient demographic change in 2012 from 2008 was the drop-off in white voting. Now, I'm discussing this because this is all around us. This is all we ever hear, so I want to address it. Now, he has some language in here. He supports, immigration reform and so forth and so on. But he says this outreach to Hispanics or any groups is way overstated. And he says, regardless of whether Republicans could or should back this Gang of Eight bill, it simply is not necessary for them to do so and remain a viable political force. In other words, they don't have to play race politics, pander politics, balkanizing politics. He says the most salient demographic change from 2008 to 2012 was the drop in white voters. Listen to this, because there's some specifics here. Using the most commonly accepted exit poll numbers about the 2008 electorate, he writes, we can roughly calculate the number of voters of each racial group who cast ballots that year. And using census estimates, we can also conclude that all of these categories should have increased naturally from 2008 to 2012 due to population growth. So from mid-2008 to mid-2012, the two election cycles, the census estimates that the number of whites voting age increased by 3 million. He says if we assume that these new voters would vote at a 55% rate, we calculate that the total number of white voters who cast the votes should have increased by about 1.6 million between 2008 and 2012. Then he says the raw exit poll data haven't come out yet, so we can't calculate 2012 data to the tenths of a percent. But he has a good handle on it. He says the white vote for 2012 could have been anywhere between 21.5% of the vote or 72.4% of the vote. So almost three-quarters of the vote. So the final answer is that there were 6.1 million fewer white voters in 2012 than we'd have expected, give or take a million. And he's doing that based on population growth, based on census data, and based on 2008 voting patterns. He said, this is the real ball game regarding demographic change in the 2012 election. If these white voters had decided to vote, the racial breakdown of the electorate in 2012, last year's presidential election, would have been 73.6% white, 12.5% black, 9.5% Hispanic, and 2.4% Asian, almost identical to the 2008 numbers. Almost identical. So who were these white voters who didn't vote? He says they're the old Ross Perot voters, largely downscale, northern, rural whites, Midwest whites. The drop in turnout occurs in a rough diagonal stretching from northern Maine across upstate New York. He said yes. Perhaps surprisingly, turnout in post-Sandy New York City dropped off relatively little. And down into New Mexico, Michigan and the non-swing state, non-Mormon Mountain West also stand out. Note also that turnout is surprisingly stable in the Deep South. Romney's problem was not with the Republican base or evangelicals. It was with these other white voters. And by the way, he said the Republican base constituted a larger share of the electorate than it did in 2004 when Bush won. He says this stands out as the heart of the Perot coalition. That coalition was strongest with secular, blue-collar, often rural voters who were turned off by Bill Clinton's perceived liberalism and George H.W. Bush's elitism. And they were largely concentrated in the North and Mountain West, Perot's worst 10 national showings occurred in southern and border states. His best showings, Maine, Alaska, Utah, Idaho, Kansas, Nevada, Montana, Wyoming, Oregon, and Minnesota. What does this tell us about these voters, he said? He said, well, as I said, they tend to be down-skilled, blue-collar whites and populists on economic issues. And while this was the most salient demographic change, it was probably not standing alone enough to swing the election to Obama. After all, I think he meant Romney. He won the election by almost 5 million votes. If we assume that there were 6.5 million missing white voters, that means that Romney would have had to win almost 90% of their votes to win. Now, given that whites overall broke roughly 60-40 for Romney, this is unlikely. In fact, if these voters had shown up and voted like whites overall have voted, the president's margin would have shrunk, but it still would have been a healthy 2.7% margin. He says, my sense is that if these voters were somehow forced to show up and vote, they would have gone 70-30 for Romney. This still only shrinks the president's margin to 1.8%, but now we're in the ballpark of being able to see a GOP path to victory. In fact, if the African-American share of the electorate drops back to its recent average of 11% from 12.5%, and the GOP wins 10% of the black vote rather than 6%, the next Republican would win, if he or she can motivate the missing whites, even without moving Hispanic or Asian votes. And he says the GOP faces a tough choice. The Republicans still have something of a choice to make. One option is to go after these downscale whites. This GOP would have to be more America first on trade, immigration, and foreign policy, less pro-Wall Street, big business, and so forth in its rhetoric. For now, the GOP seems to be taking a different route, trying to appeal to Hispanics through immigration reform. So the Republicans are doing exactly the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing, or should be doing.